Welcome, everyone. I'm going to open the floor almost immediately, but I do want to remind you that this session is being recorded, as was the last. But in this session, an open Zoom session, you will have the opportunity to turn on your microphone, turn on your camera, in which case you will be recorded. If you would like to ask a question, but you do not want to be recorded or seen, feel free to put your question into the chat box. Otherwise, Dana and Lucina are going to be helping me to look for your questions pretty much as they come. We have the hand raise function on now as well, so you can use that. Welcome back. We just had a fabulous discussion via interview, and I open the floor to everyone.
Lauren, are you gonna take stack or like call on people?
Yeah, we normally do that. Why don't I start things out just to give everyone a chance to get used to, just in case some people didn't hear me, you can, we already have a queue. Okay, thank you. So Baden has a question and then Matthew.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sasha. Great to hear you talk about your work, and thank you, panelists, as well. Sasha, my question is about the Algorithmic Justice League, and might be a bit of a boring one to kick off with, unfortunately. I was worrying about the algorithmic audits that you offer, and I was interested in like what that entails. And I noticed that it's principally about AI. I was wondering if it's more broad than that sometimes, and I mean, what kind of organizations have requested them, and what does it entail?
Yeah, great question. So this is interesting. So right now, we are getting a lot of requests from all different types of organizations, private companies, big and small, government agencies. There's basically like anyone building an AI system who is worried about or is concerned that there might be some bias in their system that they are unaware of. There are many people who want to do things better, and so they are reaching out to AJL to request algorithmic audits. Right now, we actually mostly have them on pause, and there's a few reasons for that. One is just a capacity thing. So right now we're at a moment where we're focused on building up our organization. We've made a series of key hires. Starting in January next year, we have a new director of education coming in, a new director of communication. We're really like building our team and growing our capacity to do different kinds of work. But the other reason that we kind of have a pause on AI audits is, AI audits moved very quickly over the last 2 years or so from kind of, concept that people were floating to being something that people were then trying to actively do. And then especially this year, there's a growing ecosystem of companies that are offering AI audits. Some of these are bigger companies like Deloitte, or I think IBM now has a division. So like bigger companies that other companies will go to and say, can you help us audit our systems for bias? And some of them are smaller startups. And we actually just are wrapping right now a research project where we are mapping out that ecosystem, trying to understand how many AI auditors are out there who are selling these services. Who are they? What is their background? What do they do when they conduct audits? Because the other big problem in this space is that there are very thin standards for how AI systems should work. And there is a patchwork of regulation that is not particularly clear, doesn't provide particularly good guidance or oversight. It's developing now. But so the problem is if you have everybody saying they'll do AI audits, but nobody really knows what that means and what it means to do it well and what you are auditing for compliance with, we are worried that we'll end up with a scenario where companies basically just hire whoever they want to give them a stamp of approval, and then they can say their system was audited. So we've kind of taken a step back and we're pausing and we're saying, let's map out the AI audit ecosystem and present our findings. And we should be presenting some findings at an upcoming conference in 2022. We did a series of interviews. We did we did a field-wide survey of AI auditors. We identified about 200 organizations in this space. And so yeah, stay tuned for our take on what we think is going on with AI audits, what we think it looks like to do them well, and our sort of recommendations for how to make sure that those become a useful tool for accountability and not just a fig leaf for ethics washing.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Thanks. So one of the things that I found most inspiring about the book was the discussion of pedagogy, which we haven't talked about much tonight, but which is, I think, how, as an academic, I tend to make the most difference. And I was really struck in the book with one of the kind of paradoxes or challenges of teaching design justice, which is that, you know, as I'm a technologist, I'm partially charged with making sure that undergraduates, for example, have certain kind of skills that they can put into practice. And that's in tension with the goal of teaching those undergraduates perhaps how to listen and be responsive. And you give a great example in the book of, you know, a team in one of your classes that wanted to build an app for an organization where eventually they decided that what was needed was a brochure. So I wonder if you could give us some advice and some thoughts about how you know, to structure pedagogical experiences that give students meaningful training in design justice, but also, you know, sort of train them to use their disciplinary skills in the context of design justice. And, you know, I do AI research, so if the examples are related to that, that would be most useful for me, but I'm sure that there's a broad audience for other examples.
Yeah, so as I talk about in the book, you know, my attempt to do that was largely through this, you know, course that I created at MIT called the Collaborative Design Studio. And in that course, I mean, I created it actually before, I think the first version was in 2012, maybe 2013. So that was before the Design Justice Network principles or the network kind of existed. But you know, even then, based on you know some previous work I had done, and you know, I was trying to figure out how do I bring this into you know the teaching and learning space. And I think that some of the very you know concrete things that I did. So you know, I taught that course many times. It evolved over time. I explored different approaches to it. Some of the things that I tried included, let's see, some years. I asked students to like apply together with a community partner that they already were working with that had the advantage of having the projects be focused on sort of existing relationships, which frankly is the hardest thing to build in a co-design or design justice process. Had the disadvantage though of like, then you're not providing as much of an entry point for people who might not have those relationships or that orientation yet. So let's see, then I tried versions of it where I brought a set of community organizations to the table based on relationships that I had already. And then they would each kind of like present about the work they were doing, and the students would kind of rank order the ones they wanted to work with, and I sort of would create teams accordingly, kind of matching student interest and skill sets with community organizations. That had advantages of like making it more open in terms of like who could, join the class. But the disadvantage that then like students that already had a relationship that they really wanted to work on, and bring into that space, then felt like they weren't doing what they really wanted to do. So I don't think there's one perfect model. I tried different experiments. I did, let's see, I raised money for the class to ensure that we could pay the community-based organizations something to, for their time. Probably not what their time was really worth, but I think there's also, it's pretty common, especially this may depend on the institution, certainly in an institution like MIT, there's kind of like an assumption that, well, everybody just wants to work with us and it would be such a great experience for them. That at least in my, in my experience, it was, people were surprised and confused, not outside the institution, inside the institution, that I wanted to do this, that I was like, well, yeah, we need to pay them if they're going to be spending significant time with these students. At the end of the day, these are still just like student projects, and they'll be learning the most and getting probably the most benefit out of this process. So that was valuable to do. I think that was, really worth trying to organize things that way. I think it was also really important to provide different kinds of scaffolding for students that didn't have experience working in a community, contexts. So that, included, let's see, having, I provided them with template MOUs to develop and sign, with the community partner from early on in the project, that were just written in plain language, but it was things like, what is the project about? What is the goal? What is each person going to get out of the project? Who will own the thing that comes out the other side? That type of stuff. And then later on in the development of the pedagogy and the co-design studio, I think it's also just a time thing. So like the cycles of academic life don't match the cycles of life outside, the institute. So like the fact that your students need to turn in a final project in December or whatever, well, that's when community-based organizations have to turn in their grant reports and do end-of-year giving campaigns and whatever else they may need to do. So I think also trying to find ways to think about the varying time cycles was really helpful, and some of that was like doing a more introductory course first semester, and then students that wanted to continue to really work more closely with a community organization would happen in a second term. Or another strategy that I ended up with that I think really worked well was shifting away from the expectation that there would be like a full project delivery after the end of a single semester towards project proposal orientation, and often in the form of grant proposals. So that, 1 year I did it where the students worked with the organization to really just do a lot more like problem scoping and understanding and exploring different existing possible tools they might apply, and then writing it up into a proposal that the community organization could actually just turn around like directly into a grant proposal, to fund the actual, build or implementation of the thing. And I think that was more reasonable than expecting like 3 cycles of iteration to prototype at the end. We did that a lot and we made cool prototypes, but those, they're not adoptable necessarily,
Okay, thank you so much. Val, you're up next.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for such an exciting panel and conversation. I had a question for Sasha, and it has to do with, I guess, climate tech and the ways in which Algorithmic Justice League is intersecting or not with this growing sector.
That's a great question. So we have not so far done much work directly focused on the climate tech sector. We certainly are thinking about climate in the way that we think about evaluating the potential harms of AI systems. It's extremely energy intensive to develop large scale models, and we need to take that seriously. And so, for example, as we're thinking about when we do audits, what should AI auditors be auditing for? In the survey that we just did, we did ask, do you audit the footprint? Do you audit for, the environmental impacts? Do you audit the energy use? And, no surprise, 0 of the AI auditors that we talked to do that right now. We will certainly be proposing that we think that that's something that should become a standardized part of AI audits. That's a different question though than I think you're asking. So one is like the impact of building and deploying and running AI systems, and another is the climate tech sector. So I mean, there are many subsectors within that. Are you talking about like carbon capture stuff, or like green energy stuff, or the use of like AI systems and computer vision to monitor climate developments, or like just all of it?
I guess I'm mostly interested in the opportunity for reparations in the response to climate, and in that being embedded in our tech tools, because these, are distributed on such, like they scale so much, and not only, reparations in the US, but also the idea of like global reparations. Earlier you mentioned the sort of, debt emissions and debt that the global north has, and how that also should guide a revision of our international development frameworks. So I think that's kind of the angle, and I agree with you that like finding these points of intervention is tricky. And so I think that's kind of what you're pointing at when you're asking me what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, Algorithmic Justice League is more specifically focused on AI systems. I think in the Design Justice Network, for sure, we're a community that's deeply concerned with environmental and ecological impacts, as well as the disproportionate burdens on already vulnerable human populations, and the severe threat to, as well, to non-human species and to ecological collapse. So, some of the proposed solutions that are out there, it's stuff like, carbon offsets or whatever. And, the environmental justice movement, the indigenous leaders have been saying, well, we need to leave the oil beneath the soil. We need to leave the coal in the hole. It's actually that globalized capitalism is rapidly destroying the Earth's ecosystems. And so we need a global Green New Deal to dramatically and quickly shift resource allocation so that our energy sources are sustainable. And when we do that, we have to do it in a way where the countries that currently have bloated economies that benefited from several hundred years of settler colonialism, slavery, and rampant ecological resource extraction and unchecked industrial pollution have to pay reparations, engage in technology transfer, both to internal populations that are descendants of those who experienced slavery, genocide, and displacement, and to their former colonies, so that the global economy can shift fast enough for us to avoid species death. So I think in the Design Justice Network, people would advance those type of analyses.
Toby?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your work and for the work of the community that I know you're a part of and that you so clearly articulate that you are a part of, right? That none of us is doing this work alone, but we're together. Thank you. And I have a question for you that really comes from two places that exist in my life. One is that I work in the area of how technology accelerates and amplifies gender-based violence. And I also carry with me from the late 90s that sort of almost utopic, like liberatory hope for the internet and digital technologies. And so I wonder, like, given the priorities and the worldviews that are at the root of these technologies that are saturating our lives, the colonial roots, global capitalism as an ongoing system that absorbs even radical dissent, right, and transforms it into something else that can be commodified. Like, can we actually shift technology? Can we shift the direction of technology to be in benefit of people and planet? Or do we need to opt out? Can we opt out? I would love to know your thoughts about that.
Great question as well. Yeah, I mean, I came through similarly, through the 90s. I was involved in the Indie Media Network, the independent media centers. We believed that it was possible to take this new technology of the net, and with the magic of open publishing and free libre open source software, we were going to wrest all control from the corporate media and document our movements and transform global capitalism into decentralized, autonomous, federated something. And as I talk about in the book a little bit, some of the really cool technological innovations that we developed and created kind of became demo design for the mega social media platforms of today that became the key instruments of what Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, became mechanisms for the reproduction of the matrix of domination by and large, though there are still benefits to social media. And so I'm very sympathetic to the tension that you're describing. I don't, I'm not of the strand of critic that feels that we should or even can somehow sort of like extricate ourselves from the globalized system of technoscience and from networked communication technology and so on and so forth. I think, I believe that we need to work hard to both build, actually existing alternative infrastructure and platforms and tools. And lots of people are doing that, and I support that and participate in that and think that it's important. And we also need to recognize that, the world is deeply shaped by these extremely large institutions, including the regulatory agencies, the nation states and their subcomponents, the globalized firms that dominate the space. And so what are the levers that we have to hold them to account, rein in their power to some degree, break them up when possible, force them to do less harm? I kind of think we have to do those things in parallel. And do I believe that we can do it in time to, to evade the end of our planet in terms of, the ecological collapse and species death? I mean, I don't know, but we have to try. If we don't try, it's obvious what's going to happen. So we have to work and do our best to try and transform these systems.
So we're going to have Lauren, that I'm going to call on myself, and then Anand.
Hi, Sasha. Great to hear from you and to read your book. I was interested in extending a little bit on some of the conversation that came in the last session around Principle 3, prioritizing impact over intention. And my question is around like approaches you've seen to get visibility on the extent of human impacts. And I'm currently doing a PhD at ANU, and my interest area is looking at what are some of these impacts on what it means to be human, or whether it like a framing around dignity impacts might be interesting to get at some of these deeper sorts of impacts that the way that algorithms are designed have. And so taking into account that the impact is, it's highly dependent on the individual and their context, and it's emergent and it's changing. I'm curious around your thoughts around the design of the information flows to get better visibility over what some of these human impacts are, and what might exist outside of audits, to sort of do that.
Sure. Yeah, I think so one thing is that there's definitely a conversation about harms. What do we mean by harms? What do we mean by impact? And I think at AJL, we're not only concerned with material harms and like resource allocation. That's certainly important. So that would be the example of like who's getting access to a job or not, who's getting cut off from public benefits because the algorithm said, you don't meet the means test, as Virginia Eubanks talks about in her book, Automating Inequality. So we are interested in sort of like allocation of material resources and access to opportunity as harms. We're also interested in sort of reputational harms and dignity harms. Those are real. And, the AJL was founded by Joy Buolamwini, and she has this, the story that's now been sort of, she's talked about it a lot. She has a TED Talk about it. It's in the movie Coded Bias, which is on Netflix, where, she becomes aware of the race and gender-based disparities in the accuracy of computer vision systems when she is trying to create a tool that needs to recognize her face to then overlay some AR stuff on it. And it can't see her face because she has a dark skin tone. And it doesn't see her face until she puts on a white mask. And then so she's literally a Black woman coding in a white mask so that this particular system can recognize that there's a face there. And she talks about the way that made her feel. It makes you feel invisibilized, not seen, erased. You could talk about there's many examples that Google image search classifying Black people's photos as gorillas, and the way that makes people feel when they see that. And then so you could kind of go on and on about sort of dignity harms, and we take those really seriously. And we actually think that for a lot of people that may be an important entry point into the movement for towards more equitable and accountable AI systems. The other thing I was going to say, beyond audits, how do we make those harms visible? How do we track them? We're actually right now, we've built a prototype harms reporting platform, which is meant to be public facing for people who've experienced some type of harm from an AI system. They feel harmed. And it's basically an intake, form where people can come and describe that harm to us. And it's sort of a guided intake process, because one of the things that's happened is that people constantly are reaching out to AJL telling us about, AI systems that they feel, have harmed them in some way or another. And they're doing it, they email us, they DM us, they tag us on social, they, email our whole team. And so which is great, we want to develop the type of organization that can respond to and address and, route those harm reports, also verify them. There's a whole verification thing that kind of has to happen. Honestly, we get reports that are everywhere from, my school set up an e-proctoring system and it can't see my face because I'm Black, and so I'm failing my test, which is a known problem that, we, can sort of explore further, to, whatever, like, I think that Bill Gates put a microchip in my brain with the COVID vaccine and is controlling me with an AI. And so we as an organization need to figure out what are we going to do with all these different types of incoming harm reports. And so harm incident reporting we think is an important contribution to the ecosystem, and we're working on that now, and that should be launching in early next year.
Thanks for sharing, Sasha.
I'll ask my question very briefly. You talked about the potential for breaking up big tech companies, and I'm wondering where the Design Justice Network and allied organizations stand vis-a-vis antitrust and the somewhat amazing team relative to what anyone thought could be possible that is in place right now, if there's enthusiasm there, channels open, and so forth.
Yeah, I would say, so neither the Design Justice Network nor the Algorithmic Justice League yet has a public position or statement on antitrust action. I can just speak, personally, I think it's an important tool. It's an important accountability tool that already exists. And I am also certainly encouraged by some of the appointments and the possibility that we may see some action in that direction soon. Absolutely.
I guess I wanted to come back to you talked about surveillance capitalism for briefly, and I think one really interesting example you bring up, I think in the introduction, is about tools used for organizing that allow organizers to have a better sense of who's coming to their events, but this is actually a piece, like a lot of those tools are kind of a part and parcel of the enabling tools that allow surveillance capitalism to happen. You can understand what people are doing, where they are, what they're doing, in a more fine-grained way that you could do, say, in person, in meet space, or whatever you want to call it. And so, you also said earlier, in about, there's also questions about whether certain technologies should exist, but also that you don't want to, we can't really extract ourselves from technology infrastructure. And I guess my question is about this line in which some things start moving into infrastructure, and we start thinking of them as being part of infrastructure and therefore adapt to being around them. And surveillance capitalism seems to be falling into this trap where we're like, I work on privacy. That's my research area. And it seems like we're like somehow it's getting pushed into the, well, this is just part of how the technology works. And I just want to know how you think about how we should fight back against that, or should we fight back against that, or how do we resist?
Yeah, that's so interesting. As you were talking, I'm thinking about Facebook, and I'm thinking about Facebook is it's like zombie infrastructure. It's like dying platform that nobody wants to use, but people still kind of do, sort of, and it just won't go away. But I think the passage you're talking about, in the book, is where there's a moment when I talk about Facebook's business model and the way that their incentives are disconnected from the features that community organizers might need, and that they made sort of decisions over time to make it less and less possible to connect with people. And the example was someone has come to an event, but you then can't message them without then paying to do a paid, ad placement. And that changed at a certain moment. I forget the year, but it changed. But there was it was 2010 or 2011, or I don't know quite when it was, but I remember it because it affected many people that I was in community with, who are community organizers, who are all like, oh shit, we can no longer just message everyone who's already been part of our space. Now we have to pay to reach them, and we can't pay. We're a tiny, we're an ad hoc collective or a community group with no funds or whatever. But I didn't mean that as an example of so the solution is that we use all of the tools of surveillance capitalism, but we use them in the hands of community organizers. There are people who believe that. I'm not one of them. So I don't think there's a big tension. I think that we can resist surveillance capitalism and seek strong consent in the ways that we gather and use people's personal information and data across any and all platforms. And frankly, that if we're involved in community organizing and building movements toward a more just and liberatory world, that we have sort of a duty to take that approach. And I'm really inspired by and excited by what's happening with the Consentful Technology project, and I'll drop a link here. This has been going on for a while. This is the idea that, what if we took consent seriously in technology spaces, the way that in parallel to the way that we talk about consent in relationships and in sex. And so, Planned Parenthood has, a model. Well, I don't know where the model was originally developed, but they popularized it, which is FRIES consent. And that means that consent is freely given, revocable, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And if it's not FRIES, then it's not good consent. And so what happens when you apply that model? So instead of doing sort of like click-through consent, well, maybe it's freely given. I mean, you can choose not to click, so there's an argument there. It's not revocable typically, or if it is, it's often quite difficult to revoke. It's sort of informed, but not really, because it's buried in legal language, so it's usually not conveyed in ways that are like easy to understand for people. It's definitely not enthusiastic. It's like annoyed, it's annoyed pseudo consent, and it's not specific, because typically you're not able to decouple the things that you're consenting to and the things that you're not. Although has changed a little bit with GDPR, so now you will get an increased number of sites you'll interact with where you can provide only consent to do certain types of things with your data. That's not perfect, but it's certainly an advance over just like the universal click through, whatever. So Consentful Tech is sort of, it's a project which has now developed a curriculum, which will be actually launched at a webinar, I think next week, by the Consentful Tech Project and Data for Black Lives and a few other partners who have taken this idea and developed it into a whole curriculum for what would it mean to actually build and develop consentful technology. And so I'm hopeful about that. I'd love to see more, people who are actually building systems, concretely think about, okay, what is that? How do we implement that? What does it look like to build that in? And I've been involved in several platform development projects where we are trying to build in the consentful technology approach. Revocability is super interesting. It can't really be perfect, but there are a lot of things that you can do that almost nobody does right now, like making it really easy for users at any time to not only stop paying you for the service, but say, now delete all of my, all of the data that I have. Or, I mean, data portability has been a conversation for a while too. So give me my data back. So it'd be great to see more people work on this stuff and push to implement it. Machine on learning. I love that. I haven't heard that.
Yeah, it's a topic in people are theorizing a lot about it right now, about how do you, once you've built a machine learning model, how do you extract out the data from somebody who wants to remove their data from the model? But it's, yeah, the mathematics of it, as we constitute the mathematics right now, which may not actually be the right way to constitute the mathematics that designs these kind of systems, makes it hard. So maybe there's a future more liberatory mathematics out there.
I think Val has had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, I think Lauren was trying to say something, but you were muted. Yeah, I wanted to sort of ask another question, and it connects to a conversation that exists in the UK. Mostly, I mean, I've come across it through a person called Lou Down, who has written a book called Good Services. And so it's someone who's been working as a service designer or like a UX designer within the UK government. And this intersection of design and policy, with an awareness of a lot of the issues with big tech, has led this person to become curious about the regulation of services in general. So you can think of, how the FDA regulates food and drug products, which you can think of them as services. They're industrial services, and then but then how that, like, the idea of generally regulating services and for them to always have some kind of like screening process or like audit process that is tied to the democratic government is one that I think could apply to things like AI and digital services, especially those that scale very much, as we've seen with big tech. So I wonder if that's something that you consider could be like useful or salient in the North American context, since we are where the things like big tech emerge and Silicon Valley is, and AI is greatly being pushed forward.
Yes, absolutely. I think, HAL has a proposal, which I'm putting a link here, which is, it's produced by Eric Learned Miller, Joy Buolamwini, Vicente Ordonez, and Jamie Morgenstern. They proposed an FDA-inspired model specifically for the regulation of facial recognition technologies. And you can read more about that at the following link. And they, one of the aspects of the FDA model that they thought would be particularly useful, in the AI space is the sort of categorization of things by risk. So, the challenge is partly, people in industry will say, well, if you institute all of this regulatory oversight and make all of these requirements, then nobody can build anything. And if we're a small startup, we don't have the resources to invest heavily in the impact assessment stuff and the bias audits and all of those things. So that's the kill innovation argument. And one response to that is to say, that's all bullshit. That's just industry flack and they don't want responsibility. Some advocates take that position. At AJL, we take that question seriously. We don't think it's impossible that there are some small firms that may be building certain types of systems that aren't particularly likely to be harmful or risky to people and may not need to do as intensive impact assessments and so on. And so one way around that is to propose risk-based classification, which the FDA does and other agencies do in other areas, and say, well, the riskier the system, the more potential for harm, and the more severe the harm that it might produce to people's life and livelihood and dignity and so on, the more rigorous the hoops they have to jump through. So we think that that's a potentially valuable intervention to that conversation.
So we have two hands up. I'm going to ask Sergio and Kate to please ask their questions together in interest of time, even though I'd love in some ways for this to go on forever. Sergio, you have to unmute.
Okay. Yeah, I had my question. Sasha, for your lecture.
Sergio, you have a weak connection. Can you please put your question in the chat box? Sergio, your connection is really garbled.
Yeah.
Okay. Kate, why don't you go ahead and I will let Sergio ask his question by chat.
So I would type my.
Sorry, Sergio, I'm sorry the connection's rough. That's so frustrating, but we'll look forward to reading the question in just a bit. Sasha, thanks for sharing that link, and I'm going to look at that proposal a little bit more closely, but I have to say I'm a little bit nervous about the risk-based assessment proposals. And as a comment, but I'd love to hear more thoughts about how you all are thinking about it. Maybe it's for a later time. Because police organizations in particular are using this to justify the use of police tech. They're arguing that if we can use this kind of regulatory technique, we can therefore be more trusted in terms of our use of some of these technologies. And so while it might, reduce some harms in practice, we're still enabling the institution. So I was curious as to what the league is starting to think about in terms of other kinds of regulatory interactions that can be brought together with this. So our institute has studied regulation for 20 years, and we always make an argument that we need networked regulation and governance or it won't work. And so I was curious just to hear what other things you all might be thinking about in that space. I think the risk-based things can be productive, but it might need a set of tools around them as well. And that's hard to create as an organization on their own. And obviously there needs to be other partners involved. But I'd just love to hear your thoughts on what you all are doing.
Sure, yeah, I think it sounds like that's a longer conversation. I would want to understand more specifically what you mean by the way that law enforcement are doing this. Today, of course, the markup, put out this massive study on PredPol and crime prediction software and the way that it perpetuates systematic bias against Black and Latinx communities in particular. So certainly we are aware of and following, the way that risk assessment, both like recidivism risk assessment in the criminal legal system and predictive policing, both tend to systematically reproduce racial injustice. And we're highly critical of that and, talk about that regularly. So I don't think we're proposing like an automated system for classifying the potential risk of AI systems. I think we're talking about regulators looking at applications, for systems and humans thinking about how risky might this be. And then, but yeah, it sounds like a longer conversation.
Yeah. It might be worth looking at what Ontario's police services are proposing, Toronto in particular. So they're kind of trying to use the risk-based models to assert themselves as better regulatory agents. Just might be worth checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look at that. We're not, our, how can I put this? Like right now, we're not primarily focused on proposing model legislation or something like that. That's something that we will be more involved in, in the future. We have been looking closely at the existing proposals, whether, we've contributed like, letters in support, for example, of various municipal, bills and processes. In particular, a lot has happened in face surveillance tools. Many municipalities have banned or created moratoria or created various types of limitations on the use of face surveillance. And we have supported many of those as we move towards hopefully federal oversight at some point. For now, there's a lot that can happen at the level of the municipality. And so in some ways, like that's a good place to maybe even, end, which is just that back to the adage that all politics is local and that there's a huge amount that can be done by becoming involved in local, institutional, and municipal policies around the acquisition, use, and deployment of AI systems. And so every school that uses e-proctoring, well, somebody, and the school board, made a decision that it was okay to spend money on doing, on acquiring these broken racist systems. And so students and parents and teachers together can organize and say, you need to cancel these contracts. Municipalities control, their police departments' budgets and their access to these tools. And in San Diego, there was a really great win, where the Trust SD coalition of community organizations started with a fight against one specific technology, which was cameras in street lamps that would be linked to a face surveillance system. But where they ended with was a unanimous city council resolution creating a civilian oversight board that has to review and approve any and all acquisitions of new surveillance tools by the San Diego police. New York City has just, there are problems with this, the way that they built it, or the way that, the details of the bill, but they have said that any hiring system needs to be, there need to be impact assessments done with a focus on, does it, reproduce known patterns of hiring inequality? It could be better, but it's an important move. So a lot can be done locally, so people can push their universities and cities to do better.
Sasha, any closing thoughts about appropriation of technologies in the global South and the privileges enjoyed by the global North?
Yes, thank you, Sergio. That is a really extraordinarily important question, especially, I would go even further, and, we could talk in another time. We could talk a lot about, unfortunately, the way that the extractive data practices, where we're getting a little bit of purchase, or at least having a conversation about reining them in the wealthy countries. Sadly, what may happen, or what is already happening, is tech companies are just saying, okay, the GDPR in the EU, it's harder to get people's data. Well, let's just go gather data from places where there's less regulatory oversight. And if that means let's go, hoover up data in the global South, then that's what we'll do. So absolutely, there's a lot of ways that these systems are being developed without the consent or at all of all of us, but especially those who are already on the margins. And there are many margins, and the global North, global South, or 1/3 world, 2/3 world, as Chandra Mohanty puts it, divide is real. And I don't know what to say about that, other than that the movement for design justice and the fight for equitable and accountable AI systems both are global fights, and it's not going to work if we only focus within the arbitrary borders of the modern nation state system. The tech companies certainly don't do that, and neither can our movements.
Thank you for that heart, Sergio. Thank you for that answer, Sasha. Thank you for the wonderful questions from the audience. And thank you, panelists, for joining us. Sasha, I cannot thank you enough for finding the time for us. I know that you are very much in demand, and I'm so honored that you joined us. I know that this applause will not say enough, but for what it's worth, we're going out on a note of applause and thanks.
Thank you, and have a lovely evening. Or morning, whatever time it may be where you are.
So yes, that's true.
Goodbye.
It's tomorrow morning.